Welcome to episode 7 of Kontrarian Korner. I'm Ben Kellerin. Today we have the pleasure of having Tom Luongo on as a guest. He's the author of Gold, Goats, and Guns, which is criminally underpriced, by the way. So you guys should all go check that out. And he helped me speed run the naive worldview of it's all one big club and you're not in it, to understanding some of the competing factions in high places that you see kind of around the world today. So Tom, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so one of the things I was listening to your podcast with Vince Lenchi the other day, and one of the things I wanted to start off with that stood out was basically the idea that Powell wants the yield curve to uninvert by having the long end rise. So I figured we'd start there and see where things go.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Does Powell want the long end of the yield curve to normalize? Right? Right now we've been stuck with this historic inversion of the U.S. yield curve, right, where the 210 spread has been negatively is negative or anywhere from 30 to 120 basis points for over 2 years now. And I've made the argument for a long time that part of that is the market being wary of the Fed's ability to hold on to 5.5% Fed funds rate. And that's fair, right? Given the Fed's past, I have no problem with the market, being skeptical of the Fed actually holding to its policy, since it's always disappointed us in the past. But at the same time, I think that that's also part and parcel of, a ideological split at the top of the U.S. power structure. And that politically, Janet Yellen over Treasury, and Janet Yellen, remember, the architect, or at least the caretaker of Ben Bernanke's zero-bound interest rate and QE policy. She's done everything imaginable to extend it. I mean, Yellen's tenure at the Fed was one of doing yield curve control. She did Operation Twist 2 and QE 3 and blah blah blah. So, what a shock that she would attempt to maintain that same kind of policy while at the Treasury Department. And she's done exactly that. The Biden administration has helped her along, and Congress has helped her along by running massive fiscal deficits, which allows her to issue, literal, metric shit tons of U.S. Treasuries. And she's biased those auctions and those issuances on the short end of the curve, which then depresses which depresses prices of the short end of the curve, raising the yield, keeping the yield on the short end of the curve higher than the long end of the curve, because we have a supply constraint on the long end of the curve. We have a supply glut, relatively speaking, on the short end of the curve, and that's what's keeping the yield curve inversion high. This is the 2 and this is the 10, right? Well, Powell wants that to reverse because he wants a normal yield curve where the farther out you go in time, the higher you should higher rate you should pay for your money. That's like normal, everyday, boring old interest rate theory. It's the whole purpose of that's what lending is supposed to be, right? We should demand higher yields for longer term, foregoance of being able to use our capital. That's the way it works. So what a shock. Yellen, the communist, wants public formation of capital, and Powell, the capitalist, wants the private formation of capital. So how do you get back to that? Well, you get back to that by eventually enforcing fiscal discipline and enforcing Yellen to and Congress to issue fewer treasuries per unit time, and therefore either lower the short end of the curve, which can't happen because the Fed funds rate is at 5.5%, or all of the whole yield curve has to rise. And Yellen's going to continue to do yield curve control because I think she's trying to bail out Europe. I think Europe is helping her along in this quest. I think other, and when I mean Europe, I mean the European Central Bank, which is really the prime focus. And then we have prima facie evidence that the Swiss National Bank and the Bank of England, and to a lesser extent, say the Bank of Canada, are all, in there supporting Lagarde and Yellen's yield curve control operation. And I've been talking about this forever and a day, and I'll continue to talk about it until it finally breaks. But because at some point, the Margaret Thatcher rule takes over. Eventually, you run out of other people's money. That's the problem with socialism. And yield curve control is just monetary socialism, monetary communism. I don't care. You know me. I'm a big reductionist when it comes to isms. There are only like 3 or 4, and everything else is just dust and definitions. Or another way of putting that is commie wordplay. So I think that that's the situation that everybody, that, you know, rational and normal people want, because they normally price yield curve, or a yield curve trending back towards normality, what would be known as a bear steepener trade, where the long end of the curve steepens by rising in yield, falling in price. That would also take European bonds yields higher in order to maintain rational spreads, you know, in the opinions of bond traders. And, you know, and that would break the European banking system. And that's why they're not allowing it to happen. And Yellen is literally continuing her policy of trying to hollow out what's left of the capital base and the balance sheet of the United States. That's what she's doing. And she's getting help from Congress, both rhinos in Congress and Democrats and the Biden administration and everybody else. And then everyone else is running a massive yield curve control program to support the fiction that this is what the market actually wants, when that's clearly bullshit. No, this is what they want. And they're trying to sell that as much as they possibly can. And eventually that will fail as economic data out of Europe and inflation data and this and all of these other things that we look at on a day-to-day basis that inform all the headline responses that we see in the markets. Eventually the market, you know, wakes up to the fact that, oh no, really these people aren't that powerful. They really aren't that, you know, they really aren't all that, as it were. So, and I think we're much, much closer to that point than we've ever been. And to be honest with you, with the, you know, the call for snap elections in France, the UK, Belgium, the push to ban AFD in Germany before the state elections this fall, the end of LIBOR, which I just did an interview with Mitt Dolcino about the other day, which is out there in the world, and I'm going to publish on as a Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. As a matter of fact, I was working on that this morning. Didn't get a chance to get that published yet. So I think when you take all of those things together, they don't have any other option but to try and sell us into a war so they can default behind and use the war as the excuse. This is very Martin Armstrong, right? And with that, and that ultimately in the end, that conclusion is Armstrong's, and he's held it for 20 years, and he's not wrong. And you know, I like to give credit where credit is due. Not all of these ideas are mine. So.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to watch how things play out. I think if you could kind of pull on that thread of Yellen and basically some of the ties or backroom alliances between some of the factions in Europe, in DC, in Wall Street, and maybe lay out the kind of game board as far as who kind of the dominant factions are and what some of the motivations are there. I think it'd be interesting to chat on that. And then maybe we can get into some other questions I have on the yield curve for you.
Sure. Well, I think clearly, I mean, honestly, like the whole map of what's going on is a 3-hour conversation in and of itself. Like the jumping off points to what you just kind of laid out is a bigger topic in that respect, in order to lay out the entire argument. But you know, you have old European money that doesn't want to give up power. You have old French colonial infrastructure. They're desperate to hold on to what they have left of it. France's fiscal position has always been terrible. You know, we've always heard about how terrible Italy is, or you know, go back to the pigs sovereign debt crises of 2008, 2011, 2015. But you know, all of those things were, you know, all of those crises, you know, were effectively papering over the fact that France was in just as bad a shape, and France's the position has just been deteriorating more and more and more as time goes along. And part of that is they're losing control of, you know, their previously strongly held position in the Sahel region of Africa, the CFA franc, that Giorgia Meloni of Italy informed the world about a couple of years ago. And now I just saw this morning that Niger just kicked out the French company that had been mining like the biggest uranium mine in Niger. Like they said, no, you're not welcome here anymore. This is ours. Get out. And Niger can do that because the United States has backed away from this region of the world. The Russians and the Chinese are filling in that vacuum. I mean, there's all sorts of reports of the Wagner Group. What used to be the Wagner Group was active in Niger and that whole region. Last summer, of course, Wagner's been disbanded and folded basically into the Russian military after Prigozhin's failed rebellion from last summer. Blah 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 blah. Here you have France is in the crosshairs right now, but so is really England. And I think the English are being torn apart at the seams in the same way that they're attempting to tear the United States apart at the seams. These are people who want to retain the same advantaged position that they've held through their the remnants of their colonial empires by proxy. And by proxy, I mean the United States enforcing these things by going around the world and, instituting Pax Americana. And I'm not saying that, Pax Americana is all good, and it's not saying it's all bad. There have been some good outcomes for the global world, the global economy for this. Not the least of which is that the United States basically eliminated piracy on the high seas. So, but the cost for that was, you had to expect that our intelligence services would go up and blow up your government, or you can't have nice things. Let's just put it that way. That U.S. military that's being used the Navy that's used to stamp out piracy also allows for the military to come in and, blow up your country and bomb brown people and all those things we in the alternative space, political space, we comment on, and all
the totally organic color revolutions and all that.
Right. These totally organic color revolutions, which, by the way, as I discussed with Richard Poe and others, like, this is a British idea. The color revolution is a concept using NGOs and currency manipulation and trade flows to alter the domestic population's opinion about their current government that the British didn't like. The British have been doing this shit for 300 years. This is nothing new. They're very good at it. It may actually be their superpower, right? So you have that faction in Britain that still wants that. I look at it this way: you've got like two drunken narcissists in a pub brawl over who gets to control the ant pile of Europe after all of this is done, and they're trying to continue to drag the United States into the fight, on one side versus the other. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is like, okay, you guys do what you want, but we're locking the door to the bar. Okay, call us when you get done fighting, and then we'll open the door. Okay, I think that's the best metaphor for all this, and that's what you're seeing with the BRICS and Enbridge and the unit and all these de-dollarization and the death of the petrodollar, all these things that are thrown out there as, for us to chase the shiny thing on Twitter or wherever on a day-to-day basis. Now, half of that stuff is chum, and it's not real. Some of it isn't. Some of it is actually real. And, the reality is, but that's the general gist of things. And when you look at it from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Now, the one thing that most people who are critics of the United States do not want to understand or aren't willing to accept is that this is a fundamentally ideological fight. In the ideological fight, there's two factors. One is the private versus public formation of capital. That's one layer of the ideological fight. And the other is personal sovereignty over state sovereignty. Now, Europe has never been free. Period. They've had moments where, the people rise up and change a government out. But at the end of the day, the governments are always sovereign. The French Fifth Republic is sovereign over the French people. The British Crown is still sovereign over the English. I don't care. They can assuage themselves with,
technicalities
all they want. Thank you. But now we have the EU creating the anti-democratic veneer of sovereignty for the member states as a means by which to usurp these evil local governments. Like, it's all nonsense. Whereas the United States, legally, embedded deeply into our legal system, our contract law, our contract, conflict resolution. Everything is predicated on we, the people, enshrine and ordain this Constitution, and these are the government's limited powers. By the way, the 50 little mini countries that make up the United States, otherwise known as the states, have that same language in their preamble to their constitutions. It's not like we have, some socialist enclave in, I don't know, California. No, California's constitution is still we the people, sovereign over the government. Okay. Now, that's de jure. De facto, well, it's a different story, of course. But that still has to fail because in their minds, they have to win the ideological fight that their way is the better way, that some form of monarchism or feudalism or whatever you want to call it, basically oligarch control, but sovereign oligarch control is superior to individual control. And individual sovereignty, where we have the right to collapse the government and make a new one later. And we can do so legally and not violently. Okay? This is important. Now, we're going to wind up in a situation in something like France where the Fifth Republic is going to fall. It'll be Macron or whomever succeeds him as president in 2020 after 2027. Possibly doing the same thing in order to maintain control. And they'll create a sixth republic. They'll make it look like it was the people's idea, or the people's pressure actually forced this over. But it's still not going to be a honest to God, we the people have rights and the government has enumerated powers. Okay? So it'll be the government has enumerated powers would grant you your rights, which is a sentence that actually doesn't parse in English worth the salt, worth 1,000 tons of salt. It doesn't make any sense when you parse it. So when you break it down elementally to those things, right? That's when you can start to see why they act the way they act. And then that's when you can start to predict what they're going to do next, because this is an ideological fight. The Chinese are fully okay with helping everybody who's making mistakes continue to do so. Very Sun Tzu-like, very Sun Tzu of them. The Russians are much the same way. And make no mistake, I don't think that there's, absence of malice on their part towards either the West, either Europe, the UK, or the United States. I believe that they're going to triangulate us against each other the same way that we're triangulating against each other. And it's all, like I said earlier, it's all kind of narcissistic circle jerk, all depending on your point of reference, your frame of reference. So, and then all of that, eventually once somebody, the real worry and the real danger, to wrap this up, is the following. When one party has nothing left to lose, what are they willing to do? Well, anything. That's what should scare you. That's what's got everybody on edge. Because what if Europe has nothing left to lose? What markers are they going to call in? What policies are they going to pursue? We're going to drag everybody in the West into a land war in Eurasia and Eastern Europe. Really? That's what we're going to do. I just think back to the Princess Bride, never get involved in a land war in Asia, right? And yet this is exactly what they're telling us we have to do. What? To protect what? To protect their ability to manipulate global financial markets and global regulatory scheme to their advantage. That's what they're trying to protect.
Yeah, there's definitely a way this plays out where we get to a flip the game board type scenario that's a giant mess for everybody. But maybe instead of going into the yield curve, we can kind of pivot into kind of the current situation in Ukraine and maybe a little bit on the Middle East, where, I mean, you see some of these signs where it looks, to me at least, like the NATO kind of West, that whole group under that umbrella seems like or at least we have people in power that are itching to get directly involved. Like you see stuff that has like no impact on what's going on the ground in Ukraine, like targeting like Russia's early warning nuclear radars or stuff like that, where it's like that has no impact on the day to day what's going on the ground. But basically, you're poking the bear even more and kind of trying to escalate, even though it's a bad idea. I mean, anyone paying attention can kind of see it's there's a point of no return, and we're kind of getting near that point. So
no, you're absolutely right. You have you've outlined the beginnings of this well. Why are we doing this? Why? Oh, well, Ukraine's at war with Russia. It's perfectly reasonable for them to attack targets within Russia. I agree, but take that one or two steps forward, and then look at history. And history tells you that these people have run the same operation. They ran it in World War I. They ran it in World War II. Like everybody, you talk to historians about this, and the dominant theme, I wouldn't say everybody, but the dominant theme is World War I was a war no one needed to fight. So why did it get fought? Well, ask yourself that question of why do the British and the French hate the Germans this much? What did they want back then? What did they actually want? And then you start asking yourself, okay, we had to fight this war for what reason? And it was for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with, Germany, right? And so now we're looking at World War II, which is just an extension of World War I. And then we look today and we say, well, why are we trying to fight Russia when Russia clearly would be better served as our trading partner? Like, as Putin has begged the West for years, like, why don't we just trade and get along? Why do we all have to think in terms of these, this zero-sum game then this is the part of the problem. You have people who really do believe that economics is a zero-sum game when you break it down to the commodity input level, right? Which I disagree with, by the way, fundamentally. But they don't. They're Malthusians or communists or whatever they are. They're imperialists, and they believe that economics is a zero-sum game, and for you to rise, I have to lose. There are no win-wins in these people's vocabulary, right? And so that's part of it. So, but they always have to push the intended target to the point where he gets to be the guy who goes first, and then they get to turn around and use their media engine and their outrage response engine to manufacture consent as to why Putin is the new Hitler and Hitler is the new Kaiser. And, it doesn't matter who it is, right?
Yeah, they got to have the moral high ground.
You have to have the moral high ground. Exactly. And because it's the only way they can project that, they can sell that to their people who fundamentally don't want to go to war with anyone. And so you have to create the moral the moral dimension to get people to go fight and die in swampland in Eastern Europe. And it's just dumb. And that's where it is. And that's the way so that's why we're seeing the Americans and the British. It's really a lot of this is the British, giving Ukrainians the go ahead and the training and the manpower and the expertise to strike strategic targets inside the Russian Federation. And You weaken, and it's clearly what they're doing. You weaken the Russians' ability to strike first or detect a first strike or a launch, and they're going to feel paranoid enough that they're going to go, attack an airbase in Poland as a preemptive strike to ensure that those B-1 and B-2 bombers don't take off, and that those planes don't take off. That's what's going to happen, and that's what we're going to, and then we're going to have to suffer through the incessant virtue signaling amongst political vampires and locusts and their quizzlings about how we have to keep doing this, how we have to go to war with them. And it's purely about covering and defaulting on the debt that they owe everybody. That's what it's about. Oh, and then they get to buy, and then they're going to implement, they believe they can win this war, and then they're going to implement ruinous reparations on Russia, break it up into 200 countries now, and all the rest of this, rotten nonsense, and then bankrupt Russia for the next century through ruinous reparations, no different than what they did to Germany. I read an article the other day, and I think it was in Forbes, saying, by the way, it was a mainstream media piece, so it was definitely almost like a victory lap, right? Saying, if you think, Germany paid off its war reparations from World War I, a long time ago, think again. It took 92 years for them to eventually pay back the last of their war reparations. They made their last payment in 2010. Okay? Just no different than how they restructured Greece's debt in 2015, so that Greece is paying back, the fraudulent amount of money that they owed the EU in 2015. They're going to be paying that back for another 100 years as well. Because what did they do? And this is the interesting part about this. And these people knew exactly what they were doing at Versailles. I believe Churchill knew exactly what he was doing when he went back on the gold standard in 1924. Why we instituted Bretton Woods at the pre-war price of gold convertibility after World War II, and what they're fighting today. They are purposefully misvaluing the price of gold in the open market such that they can overvalue the currencies that they're going to be forced reparations to be paid back in, causing a massive wave of deflation. And they did this previously to blame the gold standard, by the way, again, because they're communists. They got the twofer. They got the bankrupt Germany and discredit the gold standard all at the same time, when all really Britain had to do after World War I was devalue the pound by 10 or 15%, and everything would have been fine. That's not what they wanted to do. The goal wasn't to do that. The goal was to destroy Germany and keep it perpetually colonized effectively. Hitler's big crime was saying, you know what? No. I mean, that was the first of his big crimes. After the war started, then Hitler went, then it just went way off the rails. But this is one angle on World Wars I and II and the rise of Hitler and all of this stuff, why it was important. So just understand that they're trying to run the same playbook on Putin, and Putin's like, yeah, that's nice. You tried that once already after the fall of the Soviet Union and colonizing Russia, and I put the kibosh on that, and I'm going to put the kibosh on this one as well, because we are Russian, we understand these things, and we'll just nuke you and be done with it, and then deal with the global opprobrium later. I got 75% of the world that wouldn't shed a tear if City of London got nuked at this point. Like, you're the only ones who will be crying. I mean, and I'm being purposefully overstating this in order to make that point. It's it's important sometimes to really get down to it. Do you think Saudi Arabia or Iran or any Asia or any of the former British colonies really are going to be all that upset if somehow City of London was effectively wiped off the map, either financially, culturally, or physically? No. These people are all, they understand that where they're still being railroaded towards some form of neo-feudalism. and that the East India Trading Company never really ended. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you know, I may be like getting some of this stuff a little bit wrong here. I don't, you know, y'all want to fill in, you know, some of my ignorance, but the broad strokes, like, yeah, no one's really going to shed a tear if the old, you know, the old British system of financialization of other people's money, which they use to colonize the rest of the world. I don't think anybody will be really upset if that goes away. Now, of course, there are other groups out there that want to become the new colonizers, and so this is why you keep a skeptical eye at the Chinese. You know, put I'm getting the language wrong, but keep a skeptical eye at the Chinese and cast a skeptical eye at the Russians. Like, you don't think they wouldn't want to, flow into that vacuum? Of course they do. But then it gets back into, who's going to keep the piracy on the high seas down to a minimum, because no one else has a navy worth a damn to enforce that. So everybody has something to bring to the table post-conflict, except Europe. The United States still has military prowess, and they still have a base infrastructure and all this stuff. The Chinese are building a blue water navy. The Russians don't have one to speak of. But like, there's a post-war environment where there's a negotiated settlement amongst all these factions. And it's Europe that has no seat at that table, because they don't bring anything to the table after they've destroyed their own economy. They don't have any natural resources to speak of in the quantities necessary to run a global economy. It's why they need to colonize the rest of the world. They want,
and the ones they do, they aren't willing to use.
Right. Well, it's even worse than that. This is the last point. I'll turn the mic over. Just think of it this way. Yeah, well, of course you don't want to use the ones you've got. You want to use everybody else's first and get it at pennies on the dollar. And it's no different than the United States holding back all of its reserves in the Bakken and the Permian and everything else for 20 years when we were sucking the Saudis dry. Right? Same thing. And then building the dollar reserve standard on the back of the quote unquote petrodollar. Well, the Europeans were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to replace the dollar with the yuan, or with the euro, and have the euro eventually become, because of trade flows, become the oil settlement currency of choice, because they were such a massive net energy importer. They were going to use that to their advantage. And this popped into my head the other day when I was doing the market report for the patrons, where I said, we all talk about the petrodollar. What happened to the emergent petro euro? Right. And I can go into that if you want, because I think it's interesting. But it's also another big, 20-minute digression. So I don't know if we want to go too far off the rails here. So,
yeah, I think one of the things I was thinking about there when you're talking about some of the history the past 100 years and even further back, if you go and look at it, is a lot of these people have been running the same playbook for centuries, where whether it's colonies or conflicts, however you want to look at it, they basically go in, strip mine certain areas for parts and commodities, and kind of basically continue with that playbook, rinse and repeat. So
right.
I think it's one of the things that frustrates me about kind of a lot of people's current attitude, where like the conflict in Ukraine started 2 years ago, and like all these like short-term mindsets where people don't have like a big long-term kind of overarching view of history and different groups, different factions, all this stuff, I think leaves them blind to some of the realities of what's going on. So I think it'd be good to kind of pivot into some of the stuff with the yield curve and talk about, like I've heard a couple people say, oh, the yield curve is broken because like you have Yellen manipulating things, or basically the supply and all these different dynamics. But a lot of other people say when you see the yield curve uninvert, that's when the shit hits the fan as far as recession, this and that. And
it's true.
I've been seeing a lot more talk of recession lately, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on kind of what the path looks like for the yield curve moving forward if we're going to get a recession. There's been more talk of that lately with slowing housing starts, different economic indicators, stuff like that. Like, I still think we're in for higher inflation on average, probably stagflation type setup, but a lot of people are looking at the current setup and getting a little bit nervous and kind of ringing the recession alarm bell. So
no, you're not wrong. I said at the beginning of the year there would be no recession in the United States in 2024 in nominal terms. There's too much government spending to get GDP to turn negative, right? But that doesn't mean that we're not that 5.5% interest rates aren't causing a reorganization of the American economy. Some of that reorganization has to go to repairing the holes in bank balance sheets from Powell raising rates so fast. So 2024 could easily and 2023 have been a transitional year where the banking system tries to navigate, negotiate, and reprice its loan book,
commercial real estate, private equity,
right, all of that stuff at these interest rates. And they screamed for a long time that the Fed needed to cut, and Powell's like, no, we're going to hold rates higher. And they're like, but the economy is rolling over and we're going to have a recession. And yeah, exactly. But my job is not just tame inflation, which is the headline thing. It's also, if you want a long-term sustainable solution for the U.S. banking system's illnesses, and the pension system, and the real estate markets, and everything else, and the asset valuations, then you have to also shrink radically the amount of dollars flowing around the world influencing U.S. monetary policy at home. You can't have a rational domestic monetary policy in a global Eurodollar system, offshore dollar system that dwarfs the size and scope of the domestic market. You either have to have the domestic market be the dog or the tail. Take your pick. Powell wants it to be the dog and the Eurodollar markets to be the tail. So the dollars are priced based on what's going on in the United States. That's what the Fed funds rate is about. That gets transmitted to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world has to deal with it. And then they can choose whether or not they want to, originate that new mortgage or car loan or credit revolver in dollars or in euros, God forbid, or Thai baht or Russian rubles or Chinese yuan or whatever. And this is a means by which the world can de-dollarize. Like the Fed raising interest rates to 5.5% is de-dollarization of the global markets and holding it there, because those dollars overseas, when they were at the zero bound, were levered up to the high heavens. We don't need that system that way. We exported that system. Okay? It was our chief export. Cheap, leverageable Eurodollar, infinitely leverageable Eurodollars. That was our chief export under Bernanke and Yellen. So you raise the 5.5% and you hold them there. Well, now all of a sudden, all those dollars that were priced that are out there that were priced and at 0% now have to be reorganized. They have to be, those loans need to be paid off or written down, or the assets sold at a loss, or blah, 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 blah. And that's what's going on. There's a massive wave of foreign deflation occurring in that respect in the U.S. credit markets, with Powell holding on to interest rates at 5.5%. And of course, the cries of pain from the rest of the world are huge. Now, the global financial system is a big, huge thing that was blown up by Yellen and Bernanke. And for that reason, there's a lot of dollars still floating around out there, and they can be used to buy U.S. treasuries, affect bond yields, and all this stuff, as I've talked about in breaking the Treasury International Capital Report of U.S. foreign central bank holdings of U.S. treasuries. It's very clear that Europe has been buying, the Eurozone has been buying, Asia Pacific's been selling, and the rest of the world is just trying to manage their currencies within the current currency regime, and that's fine. It's not, and that's that. The rest of the world makes sense Asia Pacific's selling makes sense, especially if we're trying to trick the Chinese into invading Taiwan so that we have an excuse to cancel their QSIPs on their treasury holdings, effectively starting World War III. And it makes sense that Europe would be buying to run that yield curve control operation that Janet Yellen and Christine Lagarde were running that I described earlier, and maintain currency markets in a very tight range, meaning the euro keeps getting propped up every time it tries to drop below 106, for example, and the pound gets sacrificed for a few months and pushed back up to $1.45 and then $1.30, and now it's rolling over to $1.27. The Swiss franc gets thrown into that mix. The Japanese are trying to normalize their monetary policy after 30 years of QE and negative rates, and they're having a hard time doing so because Europe hasn't run out of money yet. I mean, in broad terms, that's what it comes down to. So if we as Americans want this to, if we want that, what I just described, which is, hey, let's have a domestic banking system and a Federal Reserve. If we have to have a central bank, let's have monetary policy that reflects what we're doing. The hell with the rest of the world. Does that not sound like financial isolationism? What did they do in the run up to World War II? The U.S. has to give up its isolationism and come and step onto the world stage and save the world from communism.
Bail out England.
Bail out England, bail out France, bail out... exactly. Same shit, different decade, right? So, or different century, it doesn't really matter. And that's why there's going to be a recession. And it's not going to be, over in a month or two. But the longer Powell holds rates at higher, as much as possible, the quicker the reorganization gets to take place, as long as the government doesn't step in the way of allowing capital to flow where it needs to go, where it wants to go. Right? Now, again, the Fed also has other tools to help, manage this. Am I saying that they're going to engineer that soft landing? No, I agree with Daniel DiMartino Booth. I think the chances of a quote unquote soft landing are vanishingly small. But that's what you have to do. Like, they called him Do Nothing Harding in 1920 and 21 because Warren Harding, as president, refused to do anything about the depression, the depression of 1920, which was one of the worst depressions in the history of the United States. It's also one of the shortest lived. GDP contracted by over 10% in 1920. And Harding did nothing. Everybody screamed. A bunch of people went broke. Everybody worked it out. And by the end of 2021, everything was rising again. Now, the Fed did step in and, spend, and create dollars and whatnot. But they were only able to do so because once the reorganization occurred, then the increased credit impulse could take effect, right? And we also had a sovereign debt crisis in Europe right around the same time. There was that little thing called, German hyperinflation, right? Which sent money screaming from Europe into the United States, which also helped this along. But Harding doing nothing actually was the impetus for why the United States got to be the safe haven flow, because we didn't gut our economy and we made ourselves attractive to catch that capital. We sat back like Thurman Munson and go, all right, we're catching the catfish on our spitball. Like, that's what we're going to do, right? I'm dating myself when I invoke those two guys. So you're telling me about, the greatest era in, in my lifetime of the New York Yankees and when baseball was actually good. But maybe the last era when baseball was actually good. Bite me, bro. But
yeah, I'm not a big fan of the pitch clocks they have nowadays. So
I gave all professional sports up for Lent a long, long time ago, and I'm not even Catholic anymore. the point being is that Powell's doing the same thing now. What happened this month? Lagarde cut rates. The SNB cut rates. The Bank of Canada cut rates. The Bank of England reluctantly held serve. They wanted to cut rates. The Board of Governors and the Bank of England, 2 voted for a rate cut out of 9. 7. It was only a 7-2 vote. This is important, right? Meaning next meeting, the Bank of England is likely going to cut. Powell held serve. And the dot plot shifted even more hawkish.
Yeah,
like,
I think
there's a positive carry thing going on here that's going to turn the U.S. dollar. And what are we looking at today? We're doing this on a Friday morning, and I've got my watch list over at investing.com up underneath the feed. And what do I see? I see the dollar up. U.S. dollar index 105.87. The euro clinging barely to 106.9. The pound for rolling over. Yeah. Big safe haven trade that's going on right now.
Yeah, I think that's set to continue. And I think one of the reasons it'll be interesting to watch, like, I can bitch and moan about valuations on different stocks all day, but at the same time, like, I think we're going to continue to see money flowing into U.S. assets, basically everywhere from bonds, gold, like physical commodities, different assets, obviously. But basically, I think U.S. assets are going to continue to see that safe haven trade like you're talking about. So I think I'd like to transition a little bit to energy markets.
Just one thing, just before you say that. It's a very simple rotation. When money starts to go to ground, first it goes to safe sovereign bonds. Then when that fails, it goes to stocks and hard assets. It goes to stocks. After stocks, so they're the next most liquid. Then they start going to commodities, gold, and hard assets. It's that rotation trade. We're in the first stage of that now. Okay.
Yeah, I think longer term, it's going to be interesting. Like the way I kind of set up my own portfolio is basically to be ahead of that flow as far as commodities and producers and stuff like that. I think that's going to be a very good place to be set up for years to come. But as far as oil markets go, like there's some stuff I've seen over the last couple of weeks that were interesting to watch. Like you have the OPEC meeting and then the giant sell-off and then the quick snapback rally. I think we're kind of right back to where we were before the meeting, but like a lot of the price action I've seen in oil markets over the last year since I started like really kind of paying closer attention to some of the day-to-day moves, it doesn't seem organic. And like there was I can't remember who was putting this out, but I think there was like 150 million barrels of futures sold like right on the open the day after the OPEC meeting and stuff like that, where it's just like that's not a fluke. So I'd be curious to chat a little bit about oil markets, where you think they might be headed, some of the different factors there, and kind of the setup where like everyone's talking about recession, worried about oil demand, and like people can argue about the numbers for as long as they want, but I mean, I think we're still going to get a summer driving season. I think people are going to continue to go on with their day-to-day lives. Like I think like the setup for oil and some of the equities, which haven't really had that rally over the last couple of weeks, I think looks pretty interesting in the back half of this year and then into 2025.
Okay, so what's funny, Ben, as you were talking, I looked at the prices of the markets. You know, an hour ago, I was cheering because Brent crude was trending above $86 a barrel, which is technically a very important level. And then lo and behold, the U.S. puts out natural gas storage numbers, which are slightly above expectations. And somehow, in the last 30 minutes of European trading, coming into 11 o'clock, oil gets bombed, stocks get bombed, gold gets bombed $30. What happened here? Europe closes, and then all of a sudden, or is getting ready to close, and there's the euro bounces a little bit. Massive amount of money dropped on the market over what? Nothing. It's a quad witching day today. So that has a lot to do with it. It means that there's 4 different sets of options, stock options that are going to expire today. So there's going to be a lot of people trying to wrench the markets back into shape so that nobody goes broke over the weekend, and we don't have margin calls and dogs and cats living together and mass hysteria and all the rest of it.
I think it was the biggest on record too.
Yeah, it is. It's the biggest quad witching day on record, right? So you have that, but when you see this kind of thing where they're literally dressing the weekly close like this, that kind of thing screams like desperate. That just screams desperation. And I'm like, but in all of it, the dollar is still up. Oil, the bounce, the washout in oil is already reversing itself. And what did it buy them? An hour, 2 hours? But they were able to push gold down like $30 in no time flat. They pushed Bitcoin down $1,000. Like, what it tells me is 2 things. One, as there's some desperation in order to try and maintain prices within a certain range. There's also, once that ends, once you get to that point and they can't push those markets any higher, then everybody who's desperate for dollars starts dumping their long positions to get dollars to go into the weekend because something has got the market spooked. Right? So I don't know, man. Like, it just feels like every day we go from stem to stern, we go from positive to negative. The internal volatility in some of these markets is off the charts. It's continuing to rise. But reality is you get a close this month above 85, 88, and you negate any potential for a downtrend forming in oil from here. You actually wind up with a very strong technical reversal signal for my mind, because you close above last month's high, which is 85, 88. And then that sets up, and that ensures that Q2 closes with a positive bent. And then we move into Q3 and everything is going to change. So it's clear that there's a need to end Q2 in a particular price range on all of these markets. And I could make the argument that everybody has the incentive for that. The banks need to dress up their balance sheets. The traders want to book their quarterly profits. The hedge fund, the hedge fund managers want to pay their quarterly bonuses
and mark up NVIDIA. Yeah,
right. So they can go, see, I made you a lot of money this quarter, and then I can, and then the market's going to fall. And then once we get into the next quarter, that's when we're going to see a change. And do I think we're going to see a change in sentiment in oil? The oil market has been bearish for months on end because the powers that be, the Biden administration, Europe, they've been doing everything imaginable to push the price of oil down, get gasoline prices reasonable, get inflation tamed. It's all based on the price of gasoline in the United States. The U.S. CPI is right now completely correlated with the 4-month rolling average of the month-over-month change in the CPI. I've published the chart multiple times. I know you've seen it, and I publish it on my Twitter feed every once in a while. And then we get morons coming, oh, it wasn't about that at all. It was about used car prices. Like, yeah, no, it really wasn't, dude. Used car prices are a derivative of gasoline prices. Like, sorry. So, people are willing to buy, used cars. Yeah, there's a lag effect in used car prices and all this other. It's like, come on, give me, just please. So, long term here, this is just screaming that there's something ready to break once we flip the calendar into July. And what happens in the beginning of July? Viktor Orban takes over as the president of the European Council, which is the European Union's Foreign Policy Council. He's going to put the kibosh on the march to war for 6 months, like it or not. Expect the EU to step up sanctions and financial damage against Hungary for this, by the way. That will happen. French elections are the 5th, I think, or the 4th. I know the UK elections were on the 4th. Like, we're getting set up for a potential radical shift in European politics. And I can tell you that they've already pre-sold the narrative to blame French voters, on the emergent sovereign debt crisis for going hard right. I've seen it's just pathetic.
Yeah, anything to the right of communism is hard right nowadays. So
yeah, I mean, if you're to the right of Karl Marx and Bertolt Brecht, well, you're a Nazi.
Yeah, it's interesting world we live in. I think the last topic, since we kind of got into elections there in Europe a little bit, the elephant in the room as far as the back half of 2024 is the U.S. election, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on a couple ideas from: is Biden the guy, to Trump's VP pick, to, I mean, we have the first debate here in about a week, and I mean, I usually kind of stay as far away from like the mainstream news and like political narrative stuff for a variety of reasons, but I mean, I almost can't help but watch what I think is going to be a slow motion train wreck. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to think about kind of the election political setup for kind of the next 4 or 5 months or whatever it is.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Why hasn't Trump picked the VP? Well, it's because he wants to pick somebody that isn't a neocon or an Israeli firster or a European, someone who they can, install after they shoot him. Let's just be frank and honest here.
Yeah.
They did it to Nixon. They did it. They did it to Reagan. Reagan wasn't supposed to survive the John Hinckley shooting. Like, okay.
So that rules out Nikki Haley.
Right. So here's so she gets to stay in the Waffle House in Greenville. Now, and we've seen nothing but false rumors and push polls and everything else saying Trump should this guy, and it's all the like classic, like the worst of the worst neoconservatives. They know they can't get away with, hey, why don't we give him Mitt Romney? Or Liz, you know what I mean? They can't do that because these guys have already staked their entire career on, and their entire persona on being the Republicans who will buck Trump and to make the globalists feel good because that's their job. No, Trump is going to go off the board and off the reservation, I think. The issue of Biden is obvious. Well, it's not obvious. There's two things. One, I'm going to say something that will sound terrible. I've said it before. I will say it again. The best thing that can happen to the United States, and I don't wish this on Joe Biden, I wish they would just allow the man to sundown in peace and quiet. I didn't say sunset. I said sundown. Go look up the term. But the best thing that can happen to the United States is for everybody to wake up the day after the debate, be horrified, and checking to see whether or not Joe Biden died because he stroked out in the middle of the friggin' debate. The man's clearly not capable of doing what needs to be done. And he's clearly not in charge of his faculties or anything else. I'm sorry, it's not fake news. And given his physical state and the stress of the lights and the this and everything else, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they drug him up so far that his heart just gives out, or he throws a clot and collapses on stage. We need that kind of mimetic collapse, that kind of Neo moment where he goes, "Oh, I know Kung Fu," where everybody breaks out of the delusion that this man is president. Okay? We've been setting it up for months that he's not in good shape. We've been setting it up for months that he's got real legal troubles, blah, 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 blah. And we've also been set up that the Democrats are gutting the country to defend this. And they're doing it on purpose. It's all part of the demoralization campaign to demoralize us. And now the vultures are all moving in to see who can come in and scoop up the nomination at the convention. And I'm going to tell you this right now. Do not at all. We've all had Kamala Harris or Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom. It's going to be Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is doing the Proof of Life tour. She is going around and talking and schmoozing all the big donors. She still has very strong control within the superdelegate donor pack within the Democratic Party. She's making the rounds. She's doing the thing, and she wants it. She still wants it, and they own her in every way, and she wants to be owned by them. So I hate to do this again, but the Hildebeest isn't outside of the realm of possibility. It's the subplot. Whether she wins or not is a different story, but she's making the rounds. She sees the vacuum. She sees the power vacuum. She's attracted to it. She wants it. Let's see what happens. Whatever they decide to do, however, they're not going to be able to sell to the American people. Whoever comes in, it's almost like they have to do all of this and get Russia to go offside first, so that they can have, the
dog and pony show.
The dog and pony show about how, oh no, I'm going to be the one to go. I've always been against Putin. I've always hated Putin. I've always said we should have bombed Russia. And whoever most credibly sells that narrative is the one that they're going to pick. But the American people aren't going to fall for that.
Really? The vote counting NGOs will have to get real busy if Clinton's the nominee. So.
Yeah, she couldn't win in 2016. Now, on the other side of that, the biggest hole to poke in that argument, and it's a big one, and it's fair, and I'm not against you making that argument, which is the following. They still haven't forgiven her for losing in 2016. But was that her losing? Or was that them not winning? I mean, did they miscalculate and then are blaming Hillary for it? I don't know. We'll see. Doesn't really matter with these people. It's that's that. Then the question is, okay, whoever we're gonna run against Trump, then they're gonna try and put Trump in jail, not let him be at the convention, right? And then institute a coup against him at the convention. And they could try that they're gonna try that one as well. I don't know. We'll see. I am still holding out hope that what Trump is doing is holding back his VP pick for as long as possible, because he's going to choose Tulsi Gabbard or somebody equally odious to them. Is the best word I can come up with. Unacceptable.
Yeah, one of the names that I would be very excited about, I think, is JD Vance. I'm not sure if you have thoughts on that.
I like JD Vance, but I don't think, and JD Vance fits his name is not longer than Trump. It's 5 letters long, and that matters. So Trump Vance, just like Trump Pence or Trump Scott or whatever, like that's a big thing, right? Credit Dexter White for that one. He's like, no, dude, that's what I'm thinking. It's like Gabbard's 2 syllables and 7 letters. That's just too much. That overshadows Trump too much. I'm like, it's possible. But don't discount that theory, because it's just part and parcel with and consistent with Donald Trump's personality. But I would prefer JD Vance to stay in the Senate. We need someone like him in the Senate to counteract, the Ram bot and all the rest of them. Like, we have to. You can't take guys like Rand Paul and JD Vance and others out of the Senate. Okay, you have to leave them in. So the bigger question is, who's going to be acceptable to whatever Sheldon Adelson's wife, was it Marilyn or whatever her name is, the one who's dangling $100 million in front of Trump. I'm like, we just gave him like $200 million for getting convicted of eating a ham sandwich 34 times. Like, how much more money does he really need, right? Stephen Miller's out there raising money for him left and right and winning legal battles. I don't know that he needs her money, but whatever. There's that angle as well. So Trump's VP pick has to be someone who is, not George H.W. Bush equivalent or Gerald Ford equivalent. I mean, it's got to be someone like that. It's got to be someone off the board. Just does.
Yeah. I mean,
and
one of the other guys I think might be interesting is Doug McGregor, but I mean, even if it's just a cabinet role for him, I'd love to see him in.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I think McGregor is, I don't think McGregor is like Secretary of Defense or anything, but I think McGregor in a National Security Council role, without a doubt, I think would be a very smart thing. I like McGregor. He's rarely right about what's actually going on in the Russian, I mean, there's a lot of things that I like about Doug McGregor, but at the same time, I also think he's a little bit out over his skis every once in a while. It's like all of these things are where all this stuff is up in the air. And don't get me wrong, like it's I appreciate Colonel McGregor's work and his position and whatnot, but certain things he's a lightweight on, and that's just the way things are. I mean, Trump's a lightweight on too many issues, and so this is just a cold, hard read of these people. And I think the one that ticks the boxes most for Trump in order to get him elected is Tulsi Gabbard, and I think that there's a détente between him and RFK, between Trump and RFK. I think RFK Jr. has moved hard left in order to split the hard left vote away from Biden. And I think that's important. I don't think RFK is running to win. I think RFK is running as Trump's wingman. And I think that there's been an agreement behind the scenes. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, I was chatting with Dave Collum yesterday, and we were talking about that a bit. And I don't agree with everything RFK says or believes, but you put that guy in charge of something health related or something to do with vaccines, it's like that's a no brainer. So
it is a no brainer. Like RFK Jr. he's a fine. His heart's in the right place on this. It's all that matters. What you need at this point are people you can trust and who are patriots. Trump at this point should understand, that he was handed a really terrible hand of cards in 2016. He didn't really have control over his Senate, so he really didn't have control over his cabinet appointments. Let's dispense with he gave us Mike Pompeo, and he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and he trusted Mitch McConnell, and that was his first mistake. Hey, Vladimir Putin trusted Angela Merkel for 15 years. Look at what it got him. You know what I mean? It got him a war in Ukraine he can't deal with. Everybody makes mistakes, and it doesn't make that prima facie evidence that they work for the blob. It means that they are fallible human beings that make mistakes. Sometimes they make big ones. What we hope for in a Trump restoration is that he makes fewer of he doesn't make the same mistakes, and two, he makes fewer of them. That's the best we can hope for at this point in time. I mean, I'll be okay with that, because that in and of itself would be enough to send trillions of dollars in global capital towards the United States, because you don't have to be good objectively in the great game of global capital. You just have to be slightly better than the next guy. That's a really important point. I heard Danielle Booth make that on Palisade Field Radio the other day. Capital will move trillions of dollars on 5 basis points. We saw it in 2021. My whole thesis is based around the 5 basis points that moved the world, right? When Powell raised the reverse repo rate 5 basis points above the Fed funds rate and moved $2 trillion into the freedom facility in 3 months. The moved the equivalent of $20 trillion worth of credit in 2 months at 10-to-1 leverage. Okay. That's all you need to do. They know this. And they know that Davos understands this. That's why they're desperately trying to hold these markets in such tight trading ranges. Because all they need is the one signal that says, yeah, we've lost control. And capital will do, it'll look like the Roadrunner and be off screen. And then Wile E. Coyote standing there going, uh-oh. Yep, here comes the rock.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting setup for the election in the back half of the year. I think immigration is going to be one of the main issues. I think it's been something to watch. I don't know if you have some extra time to discuss it, but I think it might be interesting to basically do a quick recap of the current situation. Kind of like, I'm not optimistic that any of this stuff gets fixed overnight, but I think Trump is obviously in a better position to make some of these changes than like some of the gaslighting you see out of the Biden administration on immigration. So, I mean, I think it's the biggest problem we have to fix. And there's, historical precedent in our history and other countries' history where it doesn't have to be some giant like riots and violence and all this stuff. Like it can be pretty straightforward if we do it right, but might be worth spending a couple minutes to see what you have as far as your thoughts there.
Trump could solve the immigration issue with executive orders and with a Congress that is in his back pocket. He had the ability to issue executive orders, but he didn't have a Congress that wouldn't undermine him. And he didn't have a cabinet that wouldn't undermine him. So now all we really have to do is Trump has to have coattails for us to have any further discussion about what is and is not possible in a second season of the Trump show. Okay, that's the big thing, and I think it's not just Trump winning the election that's important here. It's going to be the down ballot coattails. If he has those, the game changes completely. Okay, and looking at the electoral map or looking at the Senate and House map after the election, that's going to be a month's worth of commentary alone. It's going to take us a long time to parse who is and who isn't. Who it's and that's assuming the election doesn't take 3 months to settle. Okay, so I don't want to. I love to have these conversations, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, we really can't handicap any of that. And I'd like to, but what's the point? It's just, we're just spitballing at that point. And, we have things right in front of us that we need to get through that are far more important. The end of LIBOR in September, these elections coming up, the turnover into Q3 and what that's going to mean for things. These are the things staring us in the face, and whether or not they get NATO actively involved in Ukraine as a combatant that the United States signs off on between now and then. And don't forget, October surprise. End of LIBOR on September 30th. You don't think that there's not going to be a credit event sometime in the first, second week in October? Is that air you think you're breathing?
Yeah, I think it's this is one of the posts I wrote like in January, but I think this year is basically going to set a table for how the rest of the decade goes from politics, markets, kind of the whole geopolitical picture. So I think it's a very interesting setup, kind of the may you live in interesting times curse or gift, however you want to look at it. But I think that'd be a good place to wrap up. The closing question I kind of came up with for the podcast is, what book do you think I should add to my reading list? Can be history, finance, investments, any of those kind of nonfiction topics.
I wouldn't go nonfiction. Nonfiction is not where you're going to get your answers at this point. This is a story, right? This is I've got a few candidates here, but when I need to, I had this conversation with Dave Collin, right? When he was on the podcast last, it's like, I don't read fiction because I read mostly nonfiction. I'm like, yeah, and I read mostly fiction because fiction is where we learn all the lessons about how we learn a lot from both, but fiction teaches us different lessons. It gives us the opportunity to talk metaphorically about what's actually going on without actually engaging in all of the potential contrafactual stuff that's out there and the malmis and disinformation that's placed into the information stream by the the information by the intelligence services, our governments, and everything else. It's not just I'm not balking here because I'm like, which Grant Morrison book do I tell you to read? Do I tell you to read The Invisibles? Yeah. You want to understand the British Crown? Yeah, read that. You want to understand that? You want to understand the potential for technology like how they're setting up technology? You should read his run on Doom Patrol. Like, you should read Arkham Asylum to understand the mind of a psychopath. Like, or should you just sit down and like get a stack of the 10 best Philip K. Dick books, and that list is not hard to compile, and read those? They'll take you a weekend. Or no, they won't. I mean, if you mainline them all, they will, but then you won't learn anything. Like, we stand at a precipice of deciding whether or not we're going to allow us to embrace schizophrenia that they have laid the table out for us to eat at, or walk away from it and choose autophagy and grace and do a little fasting, right? And go out into our personal desert for 40 days and figure out who the fuck we actually are. Like, let's start there, and then figure it, and then everything else kind of lays itself out. So I don't know. I think everything I learned about geopolitics, I learned at the freaking gaming table. So like, what book should you read? That's a good question. But I'm not. But at the same time, like, I mean, I've read some nonfiction in my life that's been good, but I also understand that it's all limited, because it's always looking at things from a particular perspective where you start focusing on one period of history, and now all of a sudden you got 25 other books to read to get a full sense of the picture. So that's what I would. So that's what I would do. I would punt on nonfiction and get back into fiction.
If you had to pick one Philip K. Dick book, which one would it be? Where would I start?
Where I always tell people to start, Ubik. If you want to understand the nature and of overlapping psyops, of reality, of what it means to move from a state of selfishness to grace, it's all up there. It's all there in Ubik. Ubik is like the thesis statement of an entire period of Philip K. Dick's career. It's the last book he wrote in that period in between 1962 and 1966, where he wrote like 20 books, and half of them suck. A lot of them are decent, and a few are really good. But Ubik is like the distillation of all of those ideas that started with, for all intents and purposes, started with like The Man in High Castle and Martian Time Slip, and moved all the way chronologically down to Ubik. You could read The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep for different reasons, Blade Runner, but I think Ubik really hits it perfectly. And if Ubik doesn't do it for you, then the sister novel, The Three Sigmata of Palmer Eldritch, is also worth reading, because it's a similar story elementally, but thematically, I think it hits different notes. But
awesome. Yeah. I'll add at least a couple of those to the list and kind of start from there. I think you've given my viewers a lot to think about on a lot of different topics, but I think a good view of kind of how you see the world, what's going on, what might be coming down the pike as far as current events, politics, markets. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. So I'll wrap it up here. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.